So you're thinking about a marina, a perfectly reasonable retirement on the face of it. Boats come in, boats go out. You charge them rent for the privilege. A small office at the end of the pier, a fuel pump, a vending machine, a slip register that rolls over every spring. The brochure photograph is taken in late June with a single white sailboat reflected on still water at the magic hour. The unusual thing about marinas, which the brochure does not say, is that the asset itself, the dock and the slip and the right to put a boat in it, is in most cases not actually owned by you. It is leased from a municipal authority on a renewable basis, and the lease, naturally, is where the entire business lives or dies. By the end of this, you will know what a marina costs at 3 reference price points. Which of the 3 lease structures decides whether the asset is renewable or evictable, and which of the 4 revenue streams, none of which is slip rent, is actually load-bearing. A marina, of the kind most retirement buyers consider, has somewhere between 40 and 300 slips. The slip is the rentable unit. Wet slips, which are slips in the water with the boat tied at the dock, rent for between $1,500 and $5,000 per linear foot of boat per year, depending on geography, water depth, sheltered versus exposed positioning, and whether the slip is covered. Dry slips, which are rack storage units in a covered structure with a forklift to launch the boat on request, rent for between $800 and $2,600 per linear foot per year. A 35-foot motor cruiser at an average $2,500 per foot wet slip rate generates $87,500 in annual slip rent. A 120-slip marina at a blended average rate generates between $1.8 and $3.5 million in gross slip revenue. These are the numbers that get printed in the listing. They are also the numbers that paint the most flattering picture. Slip revenue is 40 to 60% of a marina's actual revenue stream at a well-run property. It is the headline. It is not the actual business. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Back to the lease. The dock, the pilings, the seawall, the breakwater, the dredged channel, and the underwater real estate on which the marina sits are, in roughly 90% of American marinas, not owned by the marina operator. They are leased. There are 3 structural lease patterns. The first is the Federal Corps of Engineers lease. The United States Army Corps of Engineers manages roughly 420 federal reservoirs and waterways, and most lakeside marinas on a federal reservoir operate under a Corps lease. These leases run typically 25 to 50 years with 5 to 10-year renewal terms, are subject to federal lease policy, and can be revised at renewal to reflect updated facility use fees, environmental compliance requirements, and competitive bidding requirements. The renewal is not automatic. The renewal is at the Corps' discretion. The renewal can require the operator to outbid a competing applicant who has decided he would like to be the next operator. The named retirement that lost the deal at a Corps renewal in this asset class has happened repeatedly. An operator who bought a marina in 2003 for $8 million ran it for 15 years through 2018 and submitted his renewal application that year, was outbid by a competing applicant. The Corps awarded the lease to the competing applicant. The operator's actual asset on the books after the lease was lost was the operating equipment, the brand goodwill, and the dry storage building he happened to own outright on an upland parcel. The marina itself, the dock and the slips and the channel, reverted to the competing applicant. The $8 million asset was, at lease loss, worth between $1 and $2 million. The remaining $6 million of asset value had been embedded in the lease itself. The second lease pattern is the state-controlled tideland lease. Coastal states own the tidelands. The marina sits on tidelands. The state grants a renewable lease for the marina's use of the tideland. Tideland leases vary substantially by state. California tideland leases are administered by the State Lands Commission and run typically 15 to 30-year terms, with rents tied to a percentage of the marina's gross revenue. Florida tideland leases are administered through the Board of Trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund. Massachusetts tideland leases involve Chapter 91 of the Massachusetts General Laws, which requires every project on filled or flowed tidelands to obtain a Chapter 91 license, and which has historically been administered with the kind of patient regulatory scrutiny that delays renewal by between 18 and 48 months. Each of these regimes has produced named retirements that ran out of patience before the lease renewed. The third lease pattern is the private waterfront parcel ownership pattern. The marina operator owns the upland parcel. The marina operator also owns the underwater bottomland out to the navigable channel. This is the pattern that exists in roughly 10% of American marinas and is concentrated in coastal communities where the property was platted in the early 19th century, with riparian rights running to the channel. A privately owned marina has none of the renewal risk of the other two patterns. It also costs roughly 3 to 4 times more per slip to acquire. The seller is, naturally, asking for the premium that lease renewal risk-free represents. These three lease structures are the single most important variable in a marina acquisition. The seller will not voluntarily explain which structure the marina operates under, what the remaining lease term is, what the renewal terms historically look like, and what the renewal risk profile is. The buyer must determine this independently. The forensic work is roughly 2 weeks of attorney time at $5,000 to $12,000. Almost no retirement buyer commissions it before signing. So you have understood the lease. Or, charitably, you understand that you must understand the lease. Now, the revenue side. Slip rent, as we mentioned, is 40 to 60% of a well-run marina's revenue. The other 40 to 60% comes from 4 sources. The first is fuel. A marina with a fuel dock sells gasoline and marine diesel to boats at a per-gallon margin of roughly 50 cents to $1.25. A medium-sized marina pumps between 60,000 and 250,000 gallons a year. That is between $30,000 and $312,000 in annual fuel margin. The fuel dock requires environmental compliance, underground or above-ground tank permitting, and periodic regulatory inspection. The cost of compliance is between $15,000 and $40,000 annually, depending on jurisdiction. The fuel dock is a roughly 1 to 3% profit margin business, with the catastrophic spill risk of a 1 to 3% profit margin business. The second is on-water service. Hauling, blocking, bottom paint, winterizing, summarization, occasional engine room consulting, dock line replacement, and the general category of "we know a guy" services charged at a markup over an outside contractor's actual cost. On-water service is the highest margin revenue stream at most marinas, runs at 30 to 40% gross margin, and is the segment of the business that converts the asset from a real estate operation into a small service business. It is also the segment that requires the most skilled labor, which is the segment of labor that is least available in the regional markets where most marinas are located. A retirement buyer who acquires a marina and discovers that the on-water service crew is the previous owner's son and that the son is moving to Portland in the spring has, in plain terms, lost roughly 25% of the marina's actual cash flow at the year 1 inflection. The third is dry storage, a covered rack structure that holds boats out of the water during the off-season at a per-foot annual storage rate roughly 70 to 90% of the wet slip rate, with the rack launch fee on top. Dry storage is the second highest margin revenue stream after on-water service, runs at 25 to 35% gross margin, and requires a substantial upfront capital expenditure on the rack structure itself. A new dry storage building runs between $400,000 and $1.2 million at 100 rack capacity. The fourth is the small additional retail, the ship's store, the bait counter, the ice machine, the mooring ball reservations to boats not at the dock. These are nice. They are not load-bearing. They typically contribute between 2 and 7% of marina revenue. The listing brochure naturally prefers the slip rent paragraph. The named retirement that did not end well in marina ownership, when it is not the lease renewal failure already discussed, is roughly always the same. A buyer acquires a marina at slip revenue valuation and discovers that the on-water service crew and the fuel dock margin and the dry storage operating income, which together account for nearly half the actual cash flow, are dependent on operational competencies the buyer does not have and cannot quickly hire for. Year 3, the on-water service crew has left. The fuel dock environmental compliance has incurred a $40,000 abatement, and the dry storage building needs a roof replacement the prior owner did not disclose. Net operating income for year 3 is 65% of the pro forma. The buyer sells at year 6 for 90 to 95 cents on the acquisition dollar after capitalized losses and considers the outcome a successful early retirement experiment. A second named retirement, this one on the Gulf Coast, paid $5.4 million in 2017 for a 68-slip marina with a dry storage rack of 40 units and a small fuel dock. The acquisition was at an 8% cap rate on a 1-year trailing pro forma. The pro forma did not feature the hurricane in his 4th year of ownership. The damage to the dock structure, the fuel dock containment system, and the dry storage rack was roughly $2.2 million. Insurance, after the deductible and the depreciated replacement value adjustment, paid back roughly $1.5 million of that. The buyer carried the remaining $700,000 on his own balance sheet, lost 2 seasons of operating revenue during the 18-month reconstruction, and emerged on the other side of the storm with a partially rebuilt marina, a refreshed insurance policy at substantially higher premium, and the dawning awareness that the pro forma he had bought against did not contain a single line for the once-a-decade catastrophic storm event. He sold the property in 2024 for $4.8 million, having operated it for 7 years at a net economic return of slightly less than nothing. Marina insurance is, in this regard, the 3rd most important variable in the asset class after the lease and the on-water service crew. Marine insurance has hardened substantially since 2017. Hurricane-exposed marinas in Florida, Texas, Louisiana, and the coastal Carolinas now pay between $60,000 and $180,000 annually in marine property and general liability premium for a 100-slip facility. Pre-2017, the same coverage was $40,000 to $90,000. The premium escalation has, in some cases, consumed the entire operating margin of marginally located properties. The retirement buyer who underwrites a 2026 vintage acquisition against a 2019 vintage insurance premium has, again in plain terms, miscounted the operating cost stack by between $20,000 and $40,000 a year. The capital expenditure schedule on a marina's physical infrastructure is the 4th variable the pro forma underweights. A floating dock has a useful life of roughly 30 to 45 years and runs roughly $900 to $1,400 per linear foot to replace. A fixed dock built on driven pilings has a useful life of roughly 25 to 40 years depending on water chemistry and pile treatment, and runs roughly $500 to $800 per linear foot. The seawall, if there is one, runs roughly $200 to $400 per linear foot of waterfront frontage with a useful life of 50 to 80 years. The dredged channel, if there is one, requires periodic redredging every 15 to 25 years at a cost of roughly $20 to $40 per cubic yard. A retiring operator seller who has not done the major maintenance in the previous decade is selling a marina whose effective deferred capex is between $300,000 and $1.5 million, which the buyer will absorb either in years 1 through 5 of ownership or in the loss of asset value at sale. The on-water service crew, briefly noted earlier, deserves the longer treatment it has earned. A competent on-water mechanic in a coastal market earns between $75,000 and $120,000 a year. There are not enough of them. The buyer who acquires a marina has acquired the prior owner's relationship with a specific mechanic who has been at the property for 9 to 23 years. The mechanic is in his late 50s or early 60s, has a tenuous attachment to the brand of the property, and is currently being recruited by every other marina within 120 miles. The probability that this mechanic remains at the property 4 years into the new ownership is, in industry estimates, roughly 40%. The retiring buyer who has not budgeted for either the mechanic's continued retention through a substantial raise and ownership equity arrangement or the cost of recruiting a replacement at competitive wages has under-budgeted the labor stack by roughly $50,000 to $100,000 annually. The 3 reference cases. The first is a 36-slip rural marina on a state-leased lake parcel with no fuel dock, no dry storage, and a single-room office at the end of the pier. Acquisition price $1.8 million. Annual revenue roughly $240,000 on slip rent alone. Operating costs roughly $130,000. Net operating income $110,000. A 6% cap rate. The asset is genuinely passive only if the existing tenant base remains stable, which is, in most rural lake marina cases, a function of demographic in-migration the operator does not control. The second is a 120-slip suburban marina on a Corps of Engineers reservoir lease, with a fuel dock, a dry storage rack of 50 units, and a small ship's store. Acquisition price $4.2 million. Annual revenue roughly $980,000 across all 4 streams. Operating costs roughly $520,000. Net operating income $460,000. An 11% cap rate. The lease term is the variable. If the remaining lease term is below 10 years, the cap rate is theoretical. If the remaining term is above 20 years, the cap rate is real. The third is a 220-slip coastal marina on a privately owned waterfront parcel with deeded riparian rights, full service operation, fuel dock, dry storage rack of 120 units, and a small chandlery. Acquisition price $11 million. Annual revenue roughly $2.7 million across all 4 streams. Operating costs roughly $1.5 million. Net operating income $1.2 million. An 11% cap rate. The asset is genuinely passive at the operational scale of the management team. It is also the asset where the entry capital requirement excludes most retiring buyers from the segment. If you are deploying retirement capital into a marina, the question that decides the next 20 years of your return is not which slip rent you are charging or which fuel margin you are pumping. It is what the lease structure is, what the lease term is, what the renewal risk is, and what the underwater real estate beneath the marina is actually worth without the lease wrapped around it. The slip rent is the headline. The lease is the business. The brochure photograph at golden hour is taken from the upland parcel looking at the sailboat. The actual asset is the lease beneath the water. The seller knows this. The buyer, in roughly 9 out of 10 cases, does not. An expensive retirement, a perfectly reasonable one, if the lease is.